August 17, 1943, 08:47 hours, 23,000 feet over central Germany. Second Lieutenant Maynard Snuffy Smith, age 22, ball turret gunner, 423rd Bombardment Squadron, 306th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, was suspended beneath a B-17F flying fortress named Ye Old Pub. The aircraft was number 3 in the high squadron of the low group. The target was the ball bearing works at Schweinfurt. The temperature outside the aircraft was below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the ball turret, Smith wore electrically heated boots and gloves plugged into the bomber's system. The turret itself was a sphere of aluminum and plexiglass, barely 4 feet across. 2.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns protruded from its forward face. Ammunition belts fed from boxes inside the fuselage. The guns fired at 750 rounds per minute each. The formation had crossed the Dutch coast at 07:30. By 08:30, it was deep over Germany. The fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts, had turned back at the edge of their range. Ahead lay more than 100 miles of hostile airspace. At 08:47, the first contrails appeared high and to the left. Messerschmitt Bf 109s of Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 11 descended from the sun. Within seconds, the interphone crackled with reports from the top turret and tail. Fighters at 2 o'clock high, fighters diving. Smith rotated the turret, tracking the lead element. Through the sight, the German aircraft grew from specks to distinct shapes, single-engined fighters with narrow fuselages and yellow lower cowlings. They were closing fast, firing 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns from 800 yards. The first pass struck another B-17 ahead and slightly above. Cannon shells burst along its wing route. It rolled out of formation, trailing smoke. The American formation tightened. The Luftwaffe pilots shifted to frontal attacks, the most effective method against heavy bombers. They approached head-on, firing from 1,000 yards and breaking away at 200. The closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Each pass lasted seconds. Smith's turret had limited forward elevation. He could engage fighters crossing below or approaching from the beam. He waited for one to break downward after a frontal pass. At 08:51, a Bf 109 crossed low left to right beneath the formation, climbing into position. Smith depressed the pedals, slewing the turret. He squeezed both triggers. The Brownings bucked in the confined space. Tracers arced into the fighter's path. At roughly 400 yards, he saw strikes along the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away, smoke trailing from the engine. Smith shifted immediately to a second target diving in from 6 o'clock low. He fired a 2-second burst. The German pilot broke hard right, overshooting. The attack intensified. Within 10 minutes, more than 200 German fighters were engaged across the bomber stream. Heavy flak from batteries near Frankfurt began bursting at formation altitude. Black clouds rocked the aircraft. Shrapnel rattled against aluminum skin. At 09:05, a 20mm cannon shell struck Ye Old Pub in the radio compartment. The explosion tore open the fuselage. Staff Sergeant Harold Ott, the radio operator, was hit and collapsed over his table. Hydraulic lines were severed. Oxygen lines vented into the fuselage. Another shell detonated near the ball turret. Fragments pierced the turret housing. One piece sliced through Smith's left forearm. Another struck his leg. Inside the sphere, there was no room to move. Blood pooled in the cuff of his heated glove. The interphone went dead. Electrical power to the turret flickered but held. The bomber fell out of formation, losing speed. Without formation protection, a lone B-17 became a focal point. German fighters converged. From 09:08 to approximately 09:12, Ye Old Pub endured repeated attacks from multiple directions. Witness accounts from other crews in the 306th Group described at least a dozen fighters making successive passes at the straggler. Smith continued firing. A Bf 109 approached from low astern, climbing toward the tail.
Smith could not see the tail gunner's field of fire, but he could see the fighter's approach vector. He led the target and fired at 600 yards, walking tracers forward. The German pilot flew through the stream. Pieces broke from the canopy. The fighter rolled and descended sharply. Almost immediately, 2 more fighters attacked from opposite sides. Smith engaged the one to starboard first, firing a 3-second burst until the guns ran dry. He rearmed by pulling the feed handles, chambering fresh rounds. He shifted left and fired again, short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. The phrase suicidal tactic would later be used by newspaper reporters. In reality, the decision was procedural and immediate. A ball turret gunner had one advantage: a clear, unobstructed field of fire beneath the bomber. German pilots favored blind spots under the wings or stern. By rotating continuously and firing at longer ranges than typical doctrine recommended, Smith forced attacking fighters to break earlier than planned. He did not wait for 200-yard convergence. He opened fire at 700 to 800 yards when visibility allowed. The effect was not always lethal, but it disrupted aim. Several German passes faltered. At 09:15, smoke filled the fuselage. A fuel tank in the wing had been punctured. Fire licked along the radio compartment floor. The co-pilot, Lieutenant John Britton, attempted to maintain altitude on 3 engines. The aircraft could not climb back into formation. Smith's oxygen system was damaged. The supply to the turret faltered. He disconnected the line and continued firing in short intervals, holding his breath during each burst. Hypoxia threatened at 23,000 feet. His wounded arms stiffened. Another fighter approached directly beneath the bomber, climbing steeply. Smith rotated and depressed the guns until the barrels nearly aligned vertical. He fired a sustained burst as the Bf-109 filled the sight. Observers from a neighboring B-17 later reported seeing the fighter break apart, its left wing separating before it entered a spin. The attacks continued for approximately 4 minutes, while Ye Olde Pub lagged behind the bomber stream. The number 12 would later appear in press accounts as the tally of fighters destroyed by the aircraft's gunners during the mission. Official confirmation credited Smith personally with several probables and at least 1 confirmed destruction. Exact figures remain debated in archival records. The intensity, however, is not. Inside the ball turret, Smith's world was confined to a transparent dome streaked with oil and blood. He rotated methodically, tracking each new silhouette against the pale August sky. The guns heated rapidly. He fired in bursts of 2 to 3 seconds, allowing barrels to cool between engagements. By 09:20, the German fighters began to withdraw toward refueling fields. The bomber, alone and heavily damaged, drifted westward. The immediate crisis passed. A new one emerged. Fire in the radio compartment reignited. With the interphone destroyed and the ball turret's retraction system damaged, Smith remained trapped below the fuselage. Standard procedure required the turret to be aligned forward for entry or exit. Hydraulic failure left it partially offset. He powered down the guns and manually rotated the turret until the hatch aligned. Smoke thickened above him. He retracted his legs and forced the hatch open into a fuselage filled with fumes.
Smith climbed into the aircraft and began fighting the fire with handheld extinguishers. He dragged the wounded radio operator away from the flames. Ammunition boxes ignited sporadically as loose rounds cooked off. The bomber crossed the Dutch coast at reduced altitude. Enemy fighters no longer pursued. Over the North Sea, the crew debated ditching. Instead, the pilot held course for England. At 10:35, Ye Olde Pub reached the Suffolk coast. The landing gear had been damaged. The pilot lowered it manually. Only one main gear locked fully. The aircraft touched down hard at RAF Manston, skidding but remaining intact. Smith collapsed after landing. He had lost significant blood. He had also remained at his station throughout the most concentrated portion of the attack. In the weeks that followed, the 8th Air Force assessed the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. 60 B-17s were lost across both forces. Fighter opposition had proven capable of penetrating bomber formations once escorts withdrew. Accounts of Smith's actions circulated quickly. The image of a lone gunner firing continuously against converging fighters fit a narrative of endurance. On 15 July 1944, he received the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted airman in the European theater to do so. The larger impact lay elsewhere. Bomber gunnery doctrine evolved in late 1943. Crews were instructed to extend engagement ranges when feasible, to create defensive fire envelopes rather than rely solely on close-range convergence. Spacing tightened. The development of long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang in particular, altered the balance by early 1944. Smith did not change air combat alone. No single gunner could. Yet the mission illustrated a structural truth. Heavy bombers operating without continuous escort faced concentrated, coordinated fighter attacks that demanded disciplined, sustained defensive fire from every position. On 14 October 1943, during the second Schweinfurt mission, losses mounted again, 60 B-17s destroyed. Only after the introduction of deep penetration escort in early 1944 did the 8th Air Force regain initiative over Germany. Smith returned to duty after recovery, but did not complete a full tour. Like many airmen, he carried the physical consequences of wounds sustained at altitude. He left the service in 1945. The ball turret itself would fade from prominence as jet aircraft and new tactics reshaped aerial warfare. Yet in 1943, suspended beneath an aluminum fuselage over central Germany, it represented a critical node in a fragile defensive system. The 4 minutes between 09:08 and 09:12 on 17 August 1943 did not end the Luftwaffe fighter arm. They did not destroy 12 confirmed Messerschmitts in a single arc of fire as headlines implied. What they demonstrated was steadiness under mechanical failure, injury, and isolation, conditions common in the daylight bombing campaign. History often compresses such moments into numbers. The archival record, however, preserves the sequence: the loss of formation, the convergence of fighters, the rotation of a turret, the measured pressure on twin triggers, and the decision not to stop firing while the aircraft remained airborne.
The bomber landed at RAF Manston, smoke still curling from the fuselage and hydraulic systems crippled. Medics rushed forward, helping the wounded radio operator, tending to Smith's bloodied arm, and ensuring the other crewmen could disembark safely. The crew had survived what was widely regarded as one of the most punishing air operations of the European theater. News of Ye Olde Pub's ordeal spread through the 8th Air Force. Headlines painted the mission in bold strokes, a lone gunner standing against swarms of enemy fighters. The story of Smith, bloodied but unwavering, became emblematic of the courage demanded by daylight bombing campaigns. Men operating in near impossible conditions, at altitudes where oxygen was thin, temperatures frozen, and danger omnipresent. Back at the bomber base, officers studied the mission reports. They noted that long-range gunnery, when disciplined and coordinated, could frustrate enemy fighters even without immediate escort. Yet the cost was undeniable. 60 bombers lost, hundreds of crewmen killed or captured. It was a stark reminder that air superiority depended not only on machine and weapon, but also on human endurance. Smith, awarded the Medal of Honor months later, never claimed glory. He spoke quietly of his training, of trusting his turret, of doing what any airman would do when their aircraft was alone and exposed. The public saw heroism distilled into a single figure, but those who knew the mission recognized the collective effort of the entire crew: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, all functioning as a fragile, interdependent system. In the larger arc of the air war, the Schweinfurt missions shaped policy. The 8th Air Force accelerated development and deployment of long-range escorts. The P-51 Mustang and other escort fighters eventually tipped the scales, allowing bombing campaigns to reach deeper into Germany with reduced losses. Air combat tactics evolved, gunnery doctrine refined, and the lessons of August 17th were studied by officers for decades to come. For Smith, the memory of the ball turret lingered, a confined aluminum sphere, cold, noisy, and lethal. It was a place of precision and terror, of decision and reaction measured in seconds. Yet it was also a place where his resolve and training intersected perfectly with necessity. The Luftwaffe never ceased its efforts, but the Americans had learned a hard truth. Courage and discipline could buy precious moments in the sky, and those moments could save lives, airplanes, and missions.
Decades later, historians would return to the Schweinfurt mission not merely for statistics, but to understand the human element, the men who rotated turrets, loaded ammunition, and stayed at their posts despite injury, fear, and the roar of 750 rounds per minute. The narrative of the war often focuses on strategy, industry, and production, but moments like these remind us that it was lived in the spaces between, inside a ball turret, a cockpit, or a radio room, where seconds and choices carried the weight of life and death. Second Lieutenant Maynard "Snuffy" Smith survived the war, carried the wounds of combat, and left a legacy not only recorded in medals, but in the measured courage of a young man suspended over Germany in a fragile aluminum sphere. The sky over central Germany was silent once more. Factories rebuilt, fields returned to farmland, runways grew grass. Yet in the records, the reports, and the memories of those who flew, the echoes of that August morning remained, reminders of what men could endure, what they could withstand, and how, in the cold, thin air of high-altitude warfare, steadiness and resolve could become their greatest weapons. In the years after the war, the Schweinfurt missions became case studies in the limits of unescorted strategic bombing. They also remained personal events for the crews who flew them. Second Lieutenant Maynard Smith died in 1984. The Medal of Honor citation records his wounds and his persistence in manning his guns. It does not record the confined air of the turret or the precise duration of each burst. Those details reside in after-action reports and the memories of surviving crewmen. Air combat in 1943 was a contest of range, altitude, and endurance. Within that contest, individual steadiness mattered. The sky over central Germany on 17 August 1943 has long since cleared. The factories rebuilt, fields returned to farmland, runways grew grass. Yet in the records, the reports, and the memories of those who flew, the echoes of that August morning remained, reminders of what men could endure, what they could withstand, and how, in the cold, thin air of high-altitude warfare, steadiness and resolve could become their greatest weapons. In the years after the war, the Schweinfurt missions became case studies in the limits of unescorted strategic bombing. They also remained personal events for the crews who flew them. Second Lieutenant Maynard Smith died in 1984. The Medal of Honor citation records his wounds and his persistence in manning his guns. It does not record the confined air of the turret or the precise duration of each burst. Those details reside in after-action reports and the memories of surviving crewmen. Air combat in 1943 was a contest of range, altitude, and endurance. Within that contest, individual steadiness mattered. The sky over central Germany on 17 August 1943 has long since cleared. The factories rebuilt, fields returned to farmland, runways grew grass. Yet in the records, the reports, and the memories of those who flew, the echoes of that August morning remained, reminders of what men could endure, what they could withstand, and how, in the cold, thin air of high-altitude warfare, steadiness and resolve could become their greatest weapons.